For those accustomed to dismissing as a conspiracy theory the hypothesis that the Council on Foreign Relations plots, alongside the Bilderberg Group and other circles of millionaires, the progressive, yet rapid, implementation of a world government. The CFR itself has just provided a definitive answer. In an official document, it openly embraces the project and partnership so long denied by the omniscient media commentators. In the recently released report Building a North American Community, the most powerful globalist think tank in the U.S. proposes nothing less than the abolition of borders between Canada, Mexico, and the U.S., and the transformation of the continent into a region where trade, capital, and people move freely, the foundation for easier entry into American territory. At a moment when the American population as a whole is crying out for stricter border control, and military experts are warning of the incalculable dangers of the continuous flow of terrorists and drug traffickers disguised as illegal Chicano immigrants, the declaration reveals the total contempt of the billionaire globalist elite for national security. There is no longer any doubt that the CFR plans to coldly sacrifice the American nation on the altar of the world's administrative unification, to be achieved, according to the idea of the old Morgenthau, through progressive regional integrations. However, the most surprising aspect of the report is the admission that the fusion of the three countries must be carried out along the lines proposed by the Bilderberg and Wehrkund conferences organized to foster transatlantic relations. Until now, these names had never appeared in an official CFR document. Bilderberg and Wehrkund are highly secretive groups of political and economic potentates who meet periodically, under security precautions greater than those for any meeting of heads of state, to plan the establishment of a world government and inaugurate a new planetary civilization, including, according to their critics, the fusion of all religions into a new bionic cult inspired by the theosophical trash of Madame Blavatsky and Alice Bailey. At the most recent Bilderberg meeting in Sintra, Portugal, the entire city was closed off to reporters, while behind locked doors and far from any critical oversight, figures such as the Rockefellers, Gorbachev, George Soros, and, modesty aside, our very own Fernando Enrique Cardoso were busy inventing the world our grandchildren will live in. By proclaiming its adherence to the goals of the Bilderberg and Wehrkund conferences, the CFR confirms at least part of what was denounced in some classics of conspiracy theory, such as None Dare Call It Conspiracy by Gary Allen and Larry Abraham, Seal Beach, California, Concord Press, 1972, and especially the more recent and better informed The Brotherhood of Darkness by Stanley Monteith, Oklahoma City, Hearthstone Publishing, 2000. This confession alone suffices to explain why President George W. Bush, risking the wrath of the conservative base that elected him, insists on supporting the amnesty project for 12 million illegal immigrants, thus raising to apocalyptic levels the very security risks he simultaneously claims to want to control with an iron fist. The project not only faces massive rejection from the American electorate, but was presented by two politicians whom Bush would have ample reason to consider his enemies: Ted Kennedy, the most devoted patron of all leftist causes, and John McCain, a Republican who, even under a microscope, is not easily distinguished from a Democrat. The higher interests of globalism, evidently, transcend electoral considerations, respect for the popular will, and deep political enmity. According to the CFR document, George W. Bush, Mexican President Vicente Fox, and Canadian Prime Minister Paul Martin had already declared themselves committed to the cause announced therein during their meeting in Texas on March 23, 2005. However, it would be naive to imagine that the support of the globalist elite for the rape of borders is limited to declarations of intent. It includes the planning and financial backing of decisive political actions. The report Building a North American Community was published under the sponsorship of a group of major corporations, among them Archer Daniels Midland Corporation, ADM, the main financial supporter of Senator Sam Brownback. Shortly after receiving a hefty sum of money from ADM, this Republican from Kansas began loudly proclaiming his support for the amnesty program for illegal immigrants, announcing that he did so out of Christian compassion. The globalists' fight for the most unpopular cause ever presented in the U.S. political arena is not content merely with subsidizing parliamentary maneuvers. It includes the mobilization of the masses and support for violently anti-American protests. The G2 Bulletin, published by the remarkable reporter Joseph Farah as an appendix to his online newspaper WorldNet Daily, reveals in its latest edition the main financial backers behind the movements that, going far beyond amnesty for illegals, aim to return the territories of Texas and California to Mexico. The most powerful among these movements are La Raza, LULAC, League of United Latin American Citizens, MALDEF, Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund, and MECA, Movimiento Estudiantil Chicano de Aztlán. All four are financed by millionaire foundations and corporations associated with the CFR, such as Rockefeller and Ford, Bristol-Myers Squibb, Chemical Bank, Chevron, Chrysler, General Motors, General Electric, Lockheed, Rockwell, Southwestern Bell, Quaker Oats, Verizon Foundation, AT&T Foundation, and George Soros's Open Society Institute. La Raza was practically created by the Ford Foundation. These four movements organized the recent protests that waved Mexican flags through the streets of the U.S. and declared, in the words of Mario Ablito, historic leader of MECA, decorated in 1998 by Bill Clinton, that California is going to be a Hispanic state. Those who don't like it will have to leave. The financial high elite and the vociferous militancy, which the enlightened commentators of our media present as the two poles of a life-and-death conflict caused by inequality and social injustice, are in fact one and the same force. And what drives the whole is not any of the impersonal, anonymous social causes that pseudoscience teaches are the engines of human history. It is top-down planning, accompanied by the financial, advertising, and political means to carry it out. I hope the more alert reader will immediately grasp just how much these facts make it unfeasible and suicidal to continue thinking about the world according to the usual lines proposed by the dominant intellectual chatter. The identification of globalism with Americanism, for instance, which the entirety of our talking classes presumes as a basic element for understanding international politics, is utter nonsense, and anyone who insists on it after the CFR document must be considered either a professional disinformer or an incurable fool. The most deplorable aspect in all this is not only that humanity is being dragged by fiercely ambitious elites toward goals that are not even disclosed to it. It is that the social sciences themselves, intoxicated with explanatory concepts that explain nothing, are so unequipped to account for the events of incomparable magnitude that are, right now, determining the fate of the world. When the chief agents of the historical process have plans that go beyond the comprehension of the average intelligentsia, not to mention public opinion in general, it is inevitable that such plans be put into practice with no possibility of critical discussion. Overnight, humanity will awaken, astonished, in a new world, without knowing how it got there or what exactly the rules of the game are. General ignorance will have become one of the pillars of the established power, and the ruling group will be separated from the people by a distance similar to that between the gods of Olympus and a swarm of termites underground. My students are witnesses to the effort I have made to replace prehistoric notions of sociology and political science with more suitable descriptive tools for the present state of the world. Similar efforts have been underway in various centers, but always on the margins of the academic mainstream, which remains frozen in obsolete and pretentious verbalism that, if it serves any purpose at all, is only as a marketing instrument for the implementation of policies that the very spokespersons of this discourse neither see nor understand. Needless to say, when descending from the international plane to the national one, none of the local political events can be explained without reference to the new power scheme that is forming on the planet. The blatant support of billionaire global foundations for revolutionary movements like the MST is the fundamental fact that will determine the nation's destiny in the coming years. And the few who usually mention it, like Mr. Lyndon LaRouche, do so only from the angle of their own agendas, which have nothing to do with a sincere desire to understand the process. If the left continues to obscure its own actions with the standardized discourse that camouflages true power relations, in liberal and conservative circles the discussion clings obsessively to general doctrinal proclamations that do nothing to clarify what is actually happening. It has already become evident to me, for instance, that the success of the São Paulo Forum's plan, the implementation of Ursule, the Union of Socialist Republics of Latin America, not only does not oppose the objectives of globalism, but decisively contributes to them, fostering a regional integration that would make Hans Morgenthau ecstatic and that, in the long run, would only make Latin America even more dependent on international banks. And don't come at me with the laughable illusion that Venezuelan oil is a fearsome anti-imperialist weapon. No one at the CFR or within American government circles is unaware that the state of Colorado has never exploited oil reserves equivalent to 20 times the total reserves of Saudi Arabia. In Brazil, no one knows this because it never appeared in that garbage known as the New York Times. But the people in Washington who read specialized journals know that if there's one country immune to oil blackmail, and, by extension, entirely unneeding of oil from Iraq, let alone Venezuela, it's the USA. Of course, this does not mean that globalist planners are brilliant minds who get everything right. The North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, conceived by the CFR itself as a prelude to the full integration of the US, Canada, and Mexico, was a resounding failure, and even so, the globalist planners weren't deterred. Since NAFTA, according to UN data, the number of Mexican households below the poverty line, less than $60 a month, rose from 60 to 76%, while the price of tortillas, the staple food of the population, increased by 40%. American taxpayers didn't gain anything from it either, now having to cover subsidies of 40% for their domestic corn production. So what? When someone believes they have in their head the solution to the world's problems, nothing stops their lust to tamper with the pillars of the cosmos in the name of their splendid utopia. Misery and loss are mere trifles compared to the epic grandeur of globalist plans. An article by Mr. Arnaldo Jaber published in the Caderno 2 of Estadeo on the 25th is, so I'm told, receiving great attention in Sao Paulo. In it, the Jornal Nacional commentator complains that the overabundance of proof and documents of PT criminality is still not enough to shake the judiciary out of its obstinate indifference. Everyone laughs at the truth, turns their back on it, gives it a pat on the butt. So deep is the contrast between the known facts and the cynicism of their official denial that, according to the columnist, it's even resulting in a demoralization of thought. The existence of these types of liars is dissolving our media. This new cynicism is demoralizing words, reasoning. The Portuguese language, the texts in newspapers, on blogs, on TV, radio, all of it becomes ridiculous in the face of the dictatorship of Lulopedism. Words are being emptied of meaning. Lula's re-election will be the proof that crime paid off. Lies will be truth and newspeak will be consecrated. I clearly remember writing all of this, almost in the same terms, at a time when Mr. Jaber was busy beautifying the image of Saint Lalinha and helping to prepare the advent of the state of affairs that he now deplores. The dissolution of language, for example, is not an effect of the PT dictatorship, but a precondition, purposefully created through a vast cultural campaign without which that dictatorship could never have come into power. One thing is to diagnose the process from the social signs that reveal its course in formation. A completely different thing is to acknowledge the accomplished fact that, had it been openly discussed in due time, could have been prevented. At the time I was writing texts such as PT language, double speak and strategy, useless complaint, or the clarity of the process, not to mention my 1993 book, yes, 1993, The New Age and the Cultural Revolution, the general irresponsibility of the talking classes, including Mr. Jaber, responded to me with the same cynical indifference that they now complain of encountering in the judiciary. If Mr. Jaber truly wanted to know how we ended up in the debacle that now scandalizes him, all he'd need to do is pay attention to the programs of the very same TV network he works for, which over the years prepared the nation to fall for the fraud of the left's moral superiority and to become intoxicated with the myth of Lula's purity. Reed Globo Television Network was the main force behind the implantation of Newspeak in the country. And, although Mr. João Roberto Marinho now gives discreet support to conservative organizations, his newspaper and his TV channel continue to serve the most blatant form of leftism. I understand that Mr. Jaber cannot denounce his own employers. I myself couldn't do it when I wrote for O Globo, limiting myself back then to general diagnoses in the hope that the reader, based on the sufficiently clear descriptions I provided, would be able to connect the dots himself. But Mr. J. Burr, in denouncing, belatedly, what one of his colleagues sacrificed his job, actually 2 jobs, to denounce in due time, could at least, without naming his predecessor, which would indeed be too painful for his vanity, acknowledge in general terms that he's late to the game, that he's speaking in the condition of a repentant moral accomplice and not that of an innocent, scandalized victim. I remember that I spoke so much about the things he now proclaims that at the time, meaning back in the days of the magazine Epoca, I was even accused of being obsessive and redundant. Mr. J. Burr's ability to diagnose the country's ills consists solely in his opportunistic timing of only saying things after everyone already knows them, and then posing as a prophet of the obvious. Mr. J. Burr is not the solution, he is part of the problem. The comfortable looseness of his moral conscience, however, is not an individual trait. If it were, I wouldn't even bring it up in this column, which has nothing to do with anyone's personal life. It's a general vice of the journalistic class, so eager to demand from politicians a degree of ethical rectitude it cannot uphold itself. Clarifying detail. I had barely sent this article to Diario do Comercio when a dispatch from the Associated Press arrived with the news that the Mexican parliament had just approved the decriminalization of possession and use of cocaine, marijuana, heroin, LSD, amphetamines, ecstasy, and even 2.2 pounds, yes, almost a kilo, of peyote, the hallucinogenic cactus popularized in the 1970s by Carlos Castañeda's literary hoax as a source of spiritual knowledge. Holy crap, the law still requires President Fox's approval, but, adds the agency, this doesn't appear to be an obstacle. A spokesperson for Fox has already shown the president's satisfaction with the measure, announcing, with exemplary cynicism, that it will make it easier to fight drug trafficking. The new law will exponentially increase the influx of drug-addicted American youth into Mexican territory and is being looked upon unfavorably by U.S. law enforcement authorities. But there is no doubt that it takes a massive step toward the suppression of national borders, as envisioned by the CFR and the Bilderbergers. In globalist circles, the main financier of drug legalization campaigns worldwide is George Soros. Not coincidentally, also one of the most generous donors to the movements advocating for the Mexicanization of California and Texas. For now, the masses still haven't grasped the strategic unity behind catastrophic, global-scale shifts that are portrayed in the idiotic media as spontaneous fruits of the metaphysics of progress. Little by little, the identity of the agents behind the process is becoming visible and, in the end, as the Bible announces, their folly will be evident to all.